The small town of Ash Hollow had always been a quiet place, tucked away in the Pacific Northwest, where towering pines and mist-covered mountains loomed over narrow roads. Everyone knew each other, and the routine of life rarely wavered. It was the kind of town where you could leave your doors unlocked, where neighbors stopped by you unannounced with baskets of fresh-baked pies. But all that peace and familiarity ended at the edge of Black Hollow Forest. The forest, sprawling just beyond the town's limits, was dense and old, older than the town itself, older than anyone could remember. Local legends called it haunted, and more than a few children had grown up hearing stories of ghostly apparitions and unexplained disappearances. But those were just stories, meant to scare kids into staying out of the woods. At least, that's what everyone thought. Until last fall. It started with Sarah Morgan. Sarah was 19, fresh out of high school, and determined to escape the small-town life she'd always known. One evening in late October, she told her parents she was going to a friend's house but never arrived. Her phone was last pinged near the edge of Black Hollow Forest. Search parties were organized, scouring the woods for days, but all they found was her car, abandoned at the forest's entrance, with the doors unlocked and the keys still in the ignition. No one wanted to say it, but everyone thought the same thing: Sarah had ventured into the woods. And if she had, she wasn't coming back. Weeks passed, and Ash Hollow returned to its uneasy routine. But the whispers never stopped. Some said they'd seen figures moving between the trees late at night. Others claimed to hear voices when the wind picked up, voices that didn't belong to any living soul. By November, the town's mood was grim, the air heavy with fear. Then came the night of the Halloween party. 4 friends, Lucas, Rachel, Emma, and Dylan, decided to break the tension with one last hurrah before winter set in. The annual Halloween bonfire was held just outside Black Hollow Forest, a tradition as old as the town itself. The trees stood like sentinels, casting long shadows over the crowd. Most people avoided looking too closely at the forest's edge, their gazes drawn instead to the warmth and laughter of the gathering. But not Lucas. Lucas had been Sarah's closest friend, and ever since her disappearance, something in him had changed. He had grown quiet, withdrawn, and often wandered off by himself. That night, as the fire crackled and music blared, Lucas stood just outside the circle of light, staring into the trees. Rachel noticed first. She watched him from across the bonfire, her gut tightening with unease. It was as if something was pulling him toward the darkness. She nudged Emma, who was busy laughing at one of Dylan's jokes, and nodded toward Lucas. "I think we should check on him," Rachel whispered. Emma and Dylan exchanged glances, but both shrugged. "He's probably just thinking about Sarah," Dylan said, running a hand through his messy blonde hair. "It's a hard time of year for him." "Yeah, but look at him," Rachel insisted. "Something's off." Reluctantly, the 3 made their way over to where Lucas stood, now barely visible in the shadow of the trees. Lucas, Emma called out, "Hey, you okay?" Lucas didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something deep within the forest, something only he could see. The wind had picked up, swirling through the trees and carrying with it a low, almost imperceptible whisper. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Lucas, she reached out and touched his shoulder. He flinched, finally tearing his gaze away from the woods. His face was pale, and his eyes wide with an unsettling intensity. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Dylan frowned, looking around. The wind was loud, rustling the branches, but that was it. Lucas took a step toward the tree line. "Sarah, she's in there. She's calling for me." Emma exchanged a worried glance with Rachel. "Lucas, Sarah's, can't—" "I know what you're going to say," Lucas interrupted, his voice trembling. "But she's in there. I can hear her." Before anyone could stop him, Lucas plunged into the forest. The others hesitated for only a moment before chasing after him. The forest swallowed them almost immediately, the thick pines closing in around them, muting the sound of the party behind them. The further they went, the darker it became. The canopy was so thick that even the full moon's light barely penetrated the trees. "Lucas," Dylan shouted, trying to keep up. But Lucas was moving quickly, weaving between the trees as if he knew exactly where he was going. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the forest. It wasn't just the wind anymore. There were voices, faint but distinct, whispering in a language none of them understood. Emma grabbed Rachel's arm. "We need to turn back. Something's wrong." "We can't just leave him," Rachel insisted, though fear was gnawing at her as well. Suddenly, Lucas stopped in a small clearing, his back to the others. He was staring at something on the ground, but from where they stood, they couldn't see what it was. Rachel stepped forward cautiously. "What is it?" Slowly, Lucas turned to face them, and the look on his face sent a jolt of terror through Rachel's chest. His eyes were wide and glassy, as though he wasn't fully present. His lips moved, but the words that came out were barely audible. "She's here." The others exchanged uneasy glances before stepping into the clearing. That's when they saw a shallow grave, the dirt freshly disturbed. And protruding from the earth was a hand, small and pale, the fingernails caked with dirt. Emma gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. "Is that?" But before anyone could move, the ground beneath the hand shifted, and slowly, impossibly, the figure began to rise. It wasn't Sarah. At least not anymore. The thing that stood before them was barely human. Its eyes were sunken, its skin pulled tight over bones that seemed too long, too sharp. A grotesque smile stretched across its face as it looked at Lucas. "Thank you for bringing them," it whispered in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged from the depths of the earth. Lucas stepped back, his face pale with terror, but he didn't run. None of them could. It was as if the forest itself held them in place. The creature moved forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them in a cacophony of voices, none of which belonged to anything living. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as the creature reached out, its fingers inches from Lucas's face. "Run!" Dylan screamed, breaking the spell that held them in place. They turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring which direction they went, just desperate to get away. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more frantic. Rachel didn't stop running until she saw the distant glow of the bonfire through the trees. Gasping for breath, she stumbled out of the woods, followed closely by Emma and Dylan. But Lucas was nowhere to be seen. They waited, calling his name, but he never came out. The next morning, the search parties found no trace of him. Just like Sarah, he was gone. The town of Ash Hollow remains quiet, as it always has. But the people no longer hold their bonfires near Black Hollow Forest. The legends, once dismissed as childish stories, are now whispered in hushed tones around dinner tables. And at night, when the wind picks up, the residents make sure to lock their doors and stay inside. Because if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers coming from the pines. And they're always calling for someone. So the sign at the entrance of Hollow Pine State Park was old, the paint faded, and the wood warped from years of exposure to the elements. It had been years since anyone Daniel knew had mentioned the place. Most people in town avoided the park, not because of any specific reason, but because it had simply fallen out of favor. The state had cut funding for its upkeep, and slowly, the once popular camping grounds had returned to nature, swallowed by the thick pine trees and underbrush. But for Daniel and his two childhood friends, Kate and Alex, Hollow Pines had always held a certain allure. Growing up in a small, sleepy town with little excitement, the park had been their playground. They had spent countless summers exploring the trail. Now, 10 years later, as young adults, they found themselves drawn back to Hollow Pines, yearning for one last adventure before life inevitably pulled them apart. Daniel had just finished his engineering degree, Kate was on her way to law school, and Alex was already working a corporate job in the city. Life had become too serious, too real, and they all longed for a return to the simplicity of their youth. "I can't believe we're doing this," Kate said as they pulled up to the old, overgrown parking lot. Her voice was a mix of excitement and hesitation. "I haven't been here in years." Alex smirked from the passenger seat. "Yeah, well, it was either this or that tacky bar down by the lake. You know which one I'd rather choose." Daniel, sitting behind the wheel, chuckled. "Come on, it'll be fun, just like old times. One last weekend before we all go our separate ways." The three friends stepped out of the car, their boots crunching on the gravel as they unloaded their camping gear. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the towering trees cast long shadows across the ground. It was mid-afternoon, but the dense canopy above made it feel much later, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the forest depths. As they shouldered their backpacks and set off down the familiar trail, the memories came flooding back. They passed the old lookout point where they used to sit for hours, watching the sunset over the horizon. The rusted remains of the playground equipment they had played on as kids still stood, barely visible through the tangle of vines and brambles. But something about the forest felt different now. The silence was heavier, almost oppressive, as if the trees themselves were listening. The wind barely stirred the branches, and the usual chorus of birds and insects seemed absent. After an hour of hiking, they reached their old campsite by the river. It was a small clearing nestled between two hills, with a rocky outcropping that overlooked the water. The place hadn't changed much, though the fire pit was now filled with leaves and the logs they used to sit on were covered in moss. "This is it," Daniel said, dropping his pack with a thud. "Home sweet home for the weekend." They set up their tents and built a fire, the crackling flames offering a sense of comfort against the growing darkness. As they sat around the fire, reminiscing about their childhood adventures, the tension from earlier began to melt away. They laughed, told stories, and shared drinks, the warmth of the fire keeping the chill of the forest at bay. It wasn't until late that night, after the fire had died down to glowing embers, that Daniel noticed something strange. The forest, which had been silent all evening, seemed to come alive with sound. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush, the snap of a twig in the distance. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Did you guys hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Kate and Alex exchanged glances. "Probably just an animal," Alex said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Kate frowned, her eyes scanning the darkness. "I don't know, it sounds closer than that." They listened in silence, their eyes darting between the trees. The rustling continued, moving in a slow, steady circle around the campsite. It was too deliberate, too methodical to be an animal. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent once more, the only noise the soft crackling of the dying fire. "I think we should go to bed," Kate said, her voice tense. "It's probably nothing, but we'll feel better in the morning." The others agreed, though unease hung in the air as they retreated to their tents. Daniel lay awake for hours listening to the forest. Every creak, every whisper of the wind sent a shiver down his spine. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off into a restless sleep. Daniel awoke to the sound of movement outside his tent. He blinked, disoriented, the darkness pressing in from all sides. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had dreamed it, but then he heard it again, soft footsteps just beyond the canvas walls. He sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Alex, Kate?" he called out in a whisper, but there was no response. His hand fumbled for the zipper of the tent, and he cautiously peeked outside. The fire had long since died, and the clearing was bathed in the pale light of the moon. The trees loomed like silent sentinels around the campsite, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. So there was no sign of his friends. Panic began to set in as Daniel scrambled out of his tent, calling their names again, this time louder. "Alex, Kate." Silence. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty tents and the untouched camping gear. It was as if they had simply vanished. Daniel's mind raced. Had they gone for a walk? Had something happened? He turned in a slow circle, scanning the edge of the clearing. So when he noticed it, the trail of footprints leading away from the campsite and into the dense forest. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to stay put, but the thought of his friends out there, lost or in danger, propelled him forward. Grabbing his flashlight and a small pocket knife, he followed the footprints into the trees. The further he went, the darker and quieter the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The path was uneven, covered in roots and fallen leaves, and Daniel had to be careful not to trip. As he pressed on, a strange sensation began to wash over him, an overwhelming sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every instinct told him to turn back. But he couldn't leave Alex and Kate. Not yet. Then just ahead, his flashlight beam caught something, a figure standing between the trees, barely visible in the darkness. "Alex," Daniel called, his voice trembling. "Kate?" The figure didn't move. Daniel took a hesitant step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hey, is that you?" The figure stepped into the light. It wasn't Alex or Kate. Standing before him was a man tall, gaunt, and dressed in tattered clothes that hung loosely from his emaciated frame. Type or space with gaunt mold, his skin pale as the moonlight, and his eyes, they were hollow, empty pits of darkness, as if someone had gouged them out long ago. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The man smiled, revealing a row of crooked, yellow teeth. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped, his voice low and guttural. Daniel took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The man took a slow, deliberate step toward him, his bony fingers twitching at his sides. "I'm looking for my friends," Daniel managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head, his hollow eyes narrowing. "Your friends are already lost." With that, the man vanished, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he tore through the forest, the branches clawing at his clothes. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, voices overlapping in a cacophony of words he couldn't understand. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. Finally, he burst into the clearing by the river, gasping for breath. The campsite was still empty, the tents standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. Daniel collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. He didn't know what had happened, didn't know if he would ever see his friends again. All he knew was that something ancient and malevolent lived in Hollow Pines, something that had been watching them from the moment they arrived. And now it had them. So the next morning, a group of hikers found Daniel sitting by the river, staring blankly at the water. His friends were never found. But the locals knew better than to ask too many questions. Hollow Pines had always been a place best left undisturbed, a place where the trees whispered secrets, and the shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. The park was closed shortly after that. The sign at the entrance was torn. So the weekend was supposed to be a simple escape, a retreat from the stress of work, school, and the monotony of their daily lives. For James, Aaron, and Natalie, it was a chance to reconnect with nature, to leave behind the noise of the city and immerse themselves in the peaceful wilderness. They had been friends since high school, and though their lives had pulled them in different directions, they had always managed to find time for their annual camping trip. This year, they chose a remote spot in the Pacific Northwest, a stretch of forest known as the Whispering Woods. The name alone had intrigued them, though it was little more than a local legend, just one of many stories about mysterious forests that had never been fully explained. The trail to their campsite was marked as lightly trafficked, which in the world of hiking meant secluded and undisturbed, a perfect place to unwind. They weren't thrill seekers or paranormal enthusiasts. They just wanted quiet, some fresh air, and a break from the endless notifications on their phones. The drive from Seattle took about 4 hours, but as they veered off the highway and down the winding, narrow road that led deeper into the forest, the tension in the car began to build. The trees on either side of the road were impossibly tall, their branches entwining overhead to form a natural canopy, casting the road in a deep, green twilight even though it was barely mid-afternoon. "Looks like something out of a fairy tale," Aaron said from the passenger seat, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. "So more like a horror movie," Natalie added from the back seat, her voice tinged with sarcasm, though there was a hint of unease in her tone. James smirked but didn't respond. He was focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the tight turns. The forest around them felt almost too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just the sound of their tires crunching over gravel. When they finally arrived at the trailhead, the sense of isolation was palpable. The parking lot was little more than a dirt clearing, and theirs was the only car in sight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence, once a welcome change from the city, now felt oppressive. "So you sure this is the right place?" Natalie asked, adjusting her backpack as they stood by the car. James nodded, pulling out his phone to check the map. "This is it. Trail's just up ahead. Shouldn't take more than an hour to get to the campsite." They set off down the trail, their boots crunching on the packed dirt path. At first, the hike was pleasant. The trees provided a cool shade from the late summer sun, and the trail was well-marked, winding through a series of gentle hills. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, that uneasy silence returned. About 30 minutes in, Erin paused, her brow furrowed. "Do you guys hear that?" James and Natalie stopped, listening. At first there was nothing, just the soft hum of the forest. But then faintly they heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering, like voices carried on the wind. It was so quiet that it could have easily been mistaken for the breeze, except that the air was completely still. Probably just the wind through the trees, James said, though he didn't sound convinced. Erin shook her head. There's no wind. Natalie rolled her eyes. Come on, it's just your imagination. We're in the middle of the woods. It's supposed to be creepy. They pressed on, but the whispering continued, growing slightly louder the further they went. It was never distinct enough to make out words, but it was there, just on the edge of their hearing, as if the forest itself was murmuring secrets. By the time they reached their campsite, a small clearing next to a stream, the whispering had faded, but the tension lingered. They set up their tents in relative silence, each of them stealing occasional glances at the tree line, as if expecting to see someone or something watching them from the shadows. So that evening they built a fire and tried to shake off the unease. The familiar routines of camping helped, collecting firewood, boiling water, cooking over the open flames. But as night fell and the fire became their only source of light, the forest around them seemed to close in. James sat poking at the fire with a stick, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. So anyone want to tell a ghost story? He asked, trying to lighten the mood. Erin smirked. I think the forest is doing a pretty good job of that already. Natalie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. I don't think this place is right. James looked at her, raising an eyebrow. What do you mean? She shrugged, staring into the fire. I don't know, something just feels off. I've been in the woods plenty of times, but she trailed off, glancing at the trees again. I feel like we're not alone. Come on, Nat, Erin said, forcing a laugh. Don't start with that. We're miles from anyone. There's no one out here but us. But Natalie wasn't convinced. What about the whispering? You heard it, right? That wasn't just the wind. James and Erin exchanged a look. They had heard it, but neither of them wanted to admit how unsettling it had been. James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the whispering returned. This time it was louder. The three of them froze, listening. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to surround them, as if the very trees were whispering in hushed, urgent tones. The words were still indistinct, a murmuring chorus of voices that overlapped and blended together. But there was something deeply wrong about the sound. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the trees. It was something else. Erin's eyes were wide. Okay, what the hell is that? Natalie stood up, her hands trembling. We need to go. James, trying to keep his voice calm, shook his head. It's probably just some weird acoustics, or... A sudden snap of a twig from the darkness cut him off. They all turned, staring into the trees. The whispering had stopped, and now the only sound was the crackling of the fire and their own rapid breathing. But there, just beyond the firelight, something moved. It was subtle, barely more than a shadow slipping between the trees, but they had all seen it. Pack up, James whispered, his voice tight with fear. We're leaving. They scrambled to gather their gear, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The darkness pressed in around them, and with the fire dying down, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. As they hurriedly packed their backpacks, the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. It was as if the voices were trying to communicate, to warn them or lure them. We need more light, Erin said, her voice shaking. She grabbed her flashlight and flicked it on, shining the beam into the trees. For a moment, there was nothing, just the tangled underbrush and towering pines. But then the light caught something. A figure. It stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Its form was indistinct, but it was too tall to be human, and its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, like the branches of a dead tree. Its face was hidden in shadow, but they could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. Erin let out a small gasp, her flashlight shaking as she pointed it at the thing. What is that? She whispered. No one answered. They couldn't. The fear had taken hold, paralyzing them in place as they stared at the figure in the darkness. And then it moved. Yeah. Not toward them, but around the edge of the clearing, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, as if the voices were urging them to leave. James snapped out of his trance first. Run, he shouted, grabbing his backpack and sprinting toward the trail. Erin and Natalie didn't need to be told twice. They bolted after him, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran through the trees. The trail was barely visible in the darkness, but they didn't care. All they knew was that they needed to get away from the whispering, from the figure, from whatever was lurking in the shadows of the forest. The whispering followed them, growing louder and more chaotic with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes and skin. The ground was uneven, and more than once one of them stumbled, barely catching themselves before falling. After what felt like an eternity, they burst out of the woods and into the small dirt clearing where their car was parked. James fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. They threw their gear into the back and piled into the car, their breath coming in ragged gasps. James floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, the tires spinning in the dirt before finally catching traction. As they sped down the narrow road, none of them looked back. The whispering had stopped, but the fear lingered, heavy in the air. They drove in silence for nearly an hour before Natalie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What the hell was that? No one had. Weeks passed, and though they tried to put the experience behind them, the memory of the whispering woods haunted them. Natalie had nightmares about the figure in the trees, and Erin swore she could still hear the whispering sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet. James, the most skeptical of the group, spent hours researching the area, trying to find some rational explanation for what they had encountered. But the more he dug, there were no known legends about the Whispering Woods, no stories of hauntings or strange creatures. The forest was just a forest. A forest. They say some places are cursed long before people realize it. Hidden spots where something twisted lingers just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The Hollow Grove was one of those places. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a forest avoided by locals for generations. It wasn't because of anything as dramatic as ghosts or ancient monsters, at least. That's not what people claimed. So instead, there was something subtler at work. Something wrong with the air, the trees, the way the shadows shifted just a little too quickly in the fading light. Ethan hadn't known about the stories when he first heard about Hollow Grove. To him, it was just another remote destination, perfect for the hiking trip he'd been planning with his girlfriend Laura and his two best friends, Tyler and Jess. They wanted to go somewhere off the beaten path, somewhere they wouldn't run into other campers or families, a place where they could feel like the world was theirs alone for a few days. We've done Shenandoah and Smoky Mountains, Tyler had said during one of their planning sessions. Let's try something different this time, somewhere people don't normally go. So that's when Ethan found Hollow Grove on a barely known hiking blog. The photos looked stunning, towering trees that seemed ancient, wild paths untouched by heavy foot traffic, and dense thickets of ferns and undergrowth that looked like something out of a fairy tale. It was perfect. The idea of going to a place that wasn't swarming with tourists was exactly what they all wanted. So they packed their gear, set a date, and headed off, excited for a few days of quiet. The drive took longer than expected, winding up narrow, twisting mountain roads. As they ascended deeper into the mountains, the scenery became increasingly wild. No houses, no towns, just endless trees and the occasional deer darting through the underbrush. The GPS lost signal almost an hour before they arrived, leaving them to rely on a printed map Ethan had downloaded just in case. Finally, they reached the clearing that marked the start of the Hollow Grove trailhead. The area was eerily empty. No cars, no hikers, just the forest stretching out ahead, dense and dark despite the afternoon sun. Wow, Jess said, stepping out of the car and looking around. This place is something else. Right, it's perfect, Ethan said, trying to shake off the strange feeling of isolation creeping over him. We've got the whole place to ourselves. Laura, ever the practical one, was already checking the packs and making sure they had enough water. Now let's get moving. We want to set up camp before dark. The trail was narrow, barely visible in places, overgrown with bushes and roots that made walking a challenge. The trees towered overhead, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked out much of the light. The further they went, the darker it got, even though it was still only late afternoon. Ethan felt a growing sense of unease, but he pushed it aside. It was just the unfamiliarity of the forest, he told himself. They'd been on plenty of hikes before. This was no different. After about 2 hours of hiking, they reached the spot Ethan had marked on the map, a small clearing near a stream, with enough space for their tents and a fire. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the silence was almost suffocating. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just nothing. And they set up camp quickly, trying to ignore the strange stillness around them. Tyler cracked open a beer as they sat around the fire later that evening, trying to break the tension. So, anyone know any good ghost stories? Not funny, Laura said, glaring at him. This place is creepy enough without that. Jess laughed nervously. Yeah, no thanks. I'm going to summoning any forest spirits tonight. Ethan smiled but said nothing, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't as alone as they thought. He kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see something watching them from the darkness. But there was nothing, just shadows. As the fire burned lower, they eventually crawled into their tents, exhausted from the hike. So the night was eerily quiet. the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every sound seem magnified. Ethan lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening for anything that would explain the strange feeling dawing at him. Then, just as he was about to drift off, he heard it. A soft, distant sound, like whispering. At first, he thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But the air was still, and the sound was too distinct, too human. So sat up, straining to hear. The whispering seemed to be coming from somewhere outside the camp, just beyond the light of the lake, the dying fire. "Did you hear that?" Laura's voice was barely a whisper herself, startling him. She was lying next to him, wide awake. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his heart pounding. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." Laura grabbed his arm. "No, don't." But Ethan had already unzipped the tent. "I'll be right back," he whispered, trying to sound braver than he felt. Outside, the night was darker than he had expected. The fire had all but burned out, leaving only glowing embers. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt thick with anticipation, like something was waiting just out of sight. Ethan walked slowly to the edge of the clearing, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the trees. "Hello?" he called softly. No response. Yet he stepped a little further into the woods, his pulse quickening. The beam of his flashlight danced over the twisted branches and gnarled roots. There was no sign of anyone or anything, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Something darted between the trees, quick and silent. His heart skipped a beat as he swung the flashlight in the direction of the movement, but there was nothing there, just more trees, more darkness. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "You're just spooking yourself," he muttered under his breath. "There's nothing out here." But as he turned to head back to camp, he heard it again, the whispering. Louder this time, closer, and sure. Ethan froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move. The whispering grew, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't words, it was a chorus of hissing, breathy sounds like voices speaking just out of understanding. And then he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing motionless between two trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long and its posture wrong, like something that had never learned how to mimic human movement properly. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him, cold and calculating. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. The flashlight slipped from his hand and rolled away, casting wild, erratic shadows as it spun. For a split second, the figure was illuminated in the beam, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't human. Before he could scream, the light flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. When Ethan woke up, he was lying on the ground, his head pounding. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting weak light through the trees. He sat up, his heart racing as the memory of the previous night came flooding back. The figure. The whispering. The darkness. He scrambled to his feet, searching for the others. The camp was eerily still. The fire was nothing but cold ash, and their tents looked untouched. But something was wrong. The silence was too complete. No wind, no birds, just the oppressive, unnatural quiet. "Laura," he called out, his voice shaking. "Tyler? Jess?" No response. Panic set in as he ran to their tents, ripping open the flaps. They were empty. The sleeping bags were still laid out neatly, but there was no sign of his friends. It was as if they had simply vanished during the night. Ethan's mind raced. Had they left without him? No, that didn't make sense. Their gear was still here. Their packs, their clothes, it was all untouched. He stood in the center of the camp, turning in circles, trying to make sense of it. That's when he noticed something strange. Footprints. Leading away from the campsite, into the woods. But these weren't the normal tracks of boots in the dirt. The footprints were deeper, misshapen, as if whoever or whatever had made them didn't quite know how to walk properly. They were too long, with strange gaps between each step, like something with unnaturally large feet and elongated legs had been moving through the forest. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He had to find them. Grabbing his backpack and a flashlight, he followed the trail of footprints, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering had started again, faint but ever present, growing louder with each step he took deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal hands. The path became harder to follow, overgrown and tangled with roots. The whispering was now a constant drone, rising and falling like the ebb and flow of distant waves. He couldn't tell if it was coming from ahead of him or behind. The first time Jason McKay heard the stories about Maple Creek, he laughed. He was new to the small town of Blue Ridge, North Carolina, a quiet, forgotten place tucked into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains. After living in New York City for most of his life, the peaceful town seemed like a dream. The perfect place to escape the noise, the stress, and the endless demands of corporate life. He'd bought a small cabin on the edge of the woods, right near Maple Creek. It was a fixer-upper, but the view alone, pine trees stretching into the sky, and a river cutting through the valley made it worth every penny. But the townspeople, they had other ideas. You shouldn't go too far into those woods. One of the locals, an elderly man named Earl, warned him at the hardware store. Jason had been picking up supplies to repair the roof, but Earl seemed more interested in offering unsolicited advice. The woods here, they ain't like other places. Jason smirked, glancing at the racks of tea. Earl shook his head. No, it's the Watchers. That had been the first time Jason heard the name. So the Watchers? The Watchers? Earl's gray eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Ain't no joke. Some say they've been here longer than the town itself. Longer than people. They're out there in the woods, watching, waiting. If you go too deep, you won't come back the same. Jason stifled a laugh but didn't want to offend the old man. All right, I'll keep an eye out. The warning echoed in his head long after he left the store, though he didn't take it seriously. Every small town had its folklore, its boogeymen. This was just another one. Or so he thought. 2 weeks later, Jason was finally starting to settle into his new life. The cabin was coming together, though there was still plenty to be done. One evening, after a long day of patching the roof, he decided to explore the area around Maple Creek. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and the sky glowed with shades of orange and purple as the sun set behind the mountains. He followed a narrow trail that wound through the woods, the sounds of the forest surrounding him, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the babbling of the creek nearby. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. It was peaceful, serene even, and for a while, Jason forgot about the warnings, the strange stories. But then, as the light faded and the shadows grew longer, Jason began to notice something unsettling. The woods were too quiet. He stopped, glancing around. The usual sounds of the forest birds, insects, the wind in the trees had all but vanished. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jason's skin prickled, a cold shiver running down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Hello? He called out, half expecting to see a deer or maybe another hiker. Nothing. Just silence. Jason frowned, gripping his flashlight a little tighter as he turned back toward the trail. But the path he'd been following, it wasn't there anymore. The trees seemed to have shifted, closed in, their twisted branches forming a wall of darkness. Okay, Jason muttered to himself, his heart beating faster. Don't panic. He'd been out in the woods before, plenty of times. He just needed to retrace his steps, follow the creek back to his cabin. But as he turned, trying to find his way back, a soft sound broke the silence, a whisper. Jason froze. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. But they weren't coming from any direction he could pinpoint. They seemed to come from all around him, surrounding him, whispering words he couldn't understand. Who's there? Jason called, his voice shaking despite his attempts to sound brave. No response. Just more whispers, growing louder, closer. His pulse quickened as he swung his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees, tall and skeletal in the fading light, seemed to loom over him like watchful sentinels. The whispers continued, twisting in the air, a strange mix of hissing and murmuring that made his skin crawl. Then, just ahead of him, something moved. Jason's breath caught in his throat. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but no, there was something there, something tall and humanoid, standing just beyond the edge of the creek. It was too far to make out clearly, but the figure didn't move like a person. It was wrong. He stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. Who are you? The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep, rumbling silence. And then it began to move toward him. Jason didn't wait to see what it was. He turned and ran, the underbrush tearing at his clothes as he sprinted through the trees. Branches snapped beneath his boots, his lungs burning as he tried to navigate the thickening darkness. But no matter how fast he ran, he could feel something following him. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent, and they seemed to echo inside his head like a voice speaking directly into his mind. He stumbled, nearly falling as his foot caught on a root, but he kept moving, adrenaline propelling him forward. The trees seemed to close in, the path ahead barely visible in the weak light of his dying flashlight. Finally, after what felt like hours, he burst out of the woods and onto the gravel road near his cabin. Gasping for breath, he glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the still, silent trees. He staggered back to the cabin, his heart racing, and slammed the door behind him. For a long time, he just stood there, staring out the window into the dark woods, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the forest remained still, as if nothing had ever been there. Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, the unease lingered, gnawing at him. The whispers, the figure by the creek, it all felt too real to be a hallucination, but he couldn't explain it. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, that the woods had gotten to him, that maybe he'd been overtired or dehydrated. But at night, as he lay in bed, he could hear the faintest whispering coming from the woods. No matter how tightly he closed the windows, how loud he played music, it was always there. A low, persistent hum at the edge of his hearing. And then came the dreams. So they started as flashes, images of the woods, of the creek, of that figure standing in the shadows. That they grew more vivid, more terrifying. He saw the watchers, tall, faceless figures moving silently through the trees, their elongated limbs bending and twisting unnaturally. They never spoke, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. In the dreams, they were always watching him, always just out of reach, and yet he knew deep down that if they caught him, something worse than death awaited him. Jason stopped going outside. He boarded up the windows, kept the lights on day and night, and tried to ignore the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. But the watchers didn't care about his precautions. They were already inside. A week later, Earl, the elderly man from the hardware store, noticed that Jason hadn't been seen around town. Concerned, he drove up to the cabin, but when he arrived, the place looked abandoned. The door was unlocked, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside it was chaos. Furniture overturned, windows shattered, papers scattered across the floor. But there was no sign of Jason. Except for the message. Scrawled across the walls in what looked like mud or maybe something darker were words, repeated over and over, covering every surface of the cabin. They are watching. And no one in Blue Ridge saw Jason McKay again. Some said he'd gone mad and fled into the woods. Others believed the watchers had taken him, just like they had taken others before. But the truth was, no one really knew. The only thing they were certain of was this: whatever lived in Maple Creek had been there long before them, and it would be there long after. And if you listened closely enough, late at night, you could still hear the whispers.